Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 293rd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast, and welcome back to the show. Last time for Stress Awareness Week, we talked about stress, money, and mental health. If you missed it, don't forget the podcast is now fortnightly, but if you're missing weekly content, you have 6 years worth of episodes to listen to and reflect back on. And if you want my handy guide that lists the episodes with a clickable link, you can get it at bit.ly/DMPG23. So this week, we are talking about why slashing your DEI budget is a bad idea, DEI being diversity, equity, or equality and inclusion budget. I've been thinking about this topic a lot, especially with friends and colleagues working in the same space, telling me they're struggling with the rhetoric, misunderstanding, and their work being undervalued. I myself have seen the wave and changes in attitudes towards EDI, DEI, and how it's perceived. As always, I did a little research and found a great piece summarizing the issue in Startups magazine, and that link is in the show notes. But it starts by talking about the delightful Donald Trump, how he's gutting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the US. And of course, it extends beyond the government to major corporations, removing diversity hiring goals, quietly erasing commitments they once championed. So this includes organizations like Google, Meta, Disney, Pepsi, organizations that aren't the most ethical, but have had diversity and inclusion strategies. It says, one by one, they're following suit. Sadly, when the world's biggest companies backtrack on DEI, the ripple effects spread fast. UK businesses may start to wonder, should we follow? Should we cut funding, scrap diversity targets, and roll back progress? And I think there's definitely been some of that. And in a follow-on article from Electronic Specifier, this was published on the 8th of March, International Women's Day this year, they talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a major topic in workplaces worldwide. And unless you vehemently go out of your way to avoid the news, there is no getting away from hearing about the political shift reshaping corporate approaches to DEI in the US. With executive orders rolling back initiatives, high-profile companies, the same as have been mentioned above, and equally, Deloitte have adjusted their policies. But what does this mean for UK business? And in this article, they spoke to Jonathan Mansfield, an employment partner at Spencer West LLP. And he says his view in this article is, despite the changes in the US, the UK maintains a firm stance on DEI, citing that a survey by Occupational Health Assessment Limited found that 53% of UK employers continue to support DEI, with 22 actively strengthening initiatives. Mansfield also highlighted that while 69% of employers acknowledge that US policy shifts could have some influence, there is little evidence of a major change in direction. He says commitment to DEI is strongly embedded in the UK. Without the external political pressure, a seismic change of direction is unlikely on this side of the pond. Now, that of course is interesting, and I'm not an employment lawyer, so I'm sure I don't see the same things as he does. But I think when we use the term DEI, of course, we do need to think broadly, but what does that actually mean? Because of course, we can't shed the directives, and rightly so, on gender pay gap, for example, so that will continue. But we see the conversation around disability benefits and the horrific circumstances around that. I don't think there's been enough uproar around it. And of course, that permeates into the workplace. So different aspects of DEI are treated with different approaches. So while we're not getting rid of the whole thing altogether, I definitely think we've seen steps back. Now, diversity, equity, or equality and inclusion is a familiar phrase. And I think that's the thing. It encompasses many wide issues. And in the workplace, we're looking at legal briefings on discrimination, touching on equality law, but we're also looking at how do we create workplace culture that is based in equity. We also are looking at workplace policies that meet standards, but also can go above and beyond that and be innovative. And of course, this together creates a workforce and workplace culture. And interestingly, the UK Employment Rights Minister, Justin Madders, did state that British firms operate under their own approach to equality and should not be influenced by US pressures to scale back diversity initiatives. So that's really interesting. And I found a really great article on Farrers, the legal firm, about the future of DEI. So really, really good. And, recently when I've been doing my big program on inclusive leadership for the University of London, there was a specific delegate who said, I felt like we have been on the right side of the right page for a while. We've been having productive conversations. That seems to have shifted, and now people are moving apart. And the difficulty with that is the polarization, and bringing people together to have a conversation of understanding is becoming more and more difficult. And I agree, and I think that that's one of the biggest challenges. And I also feel that, of course, there's so many redundancies at the moment. There's so many pressures on organizations, particularly small and medium-sized organizations. But higher education sector at the moment is making an awful lot of they've got voluntary severance programs and redundancies. Strike action has been increasing, and I think strike action is really important. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. But slashing these budgets that support DEI, EDI initiatives seems like a quick win and an easy cost-saving measure. But I do think in reality, it can cost much more in grievances, tribunals, and serious miscommunication, from not putting reasonable adjustments in place for disabled staff in a timely fashion to hate speech in the workplace, or people supporting certain things that have been said by, I'm going to use the term, unsavory characters. Not to mention that it erodes trust and, of course, psychological safety. Employees from all underrepresented backgrounds are feeling these cuts emotionally, so it does seem to signal that their needs and experiences are not valid. And remember that Gen Z, younger workers, do prioritize inclusive cultures much more than potentially other generations because of the environment that they've grown up in. And it can be a real deal breaker when it comes to them staying in a role. So what looks like saving money on paper can become a very expensive workplace debt. And I think for managers, the impact is even sharper. So when training's cut, there's no coaching, staff networks disappear, managers are left to navigate complex people issues without the tools, confidence, or inclusive language that DEI programs can provide. So many managers have said to me they don't feel confident, they feel really ill-equipped, they don't know how to handle the conflict, they don't know how to call out microaggressions, bullying, and the team dynamics that change or shift as a result of that. And in the UK, JSK has notably scaled back on its diversity, equality, and inclusion efforts, pausing their diversity mentoring programs and removing references to diversity from its website. And I'm guessing that's because of the connection with the US and the diktat that if you are based in the US in any way, you do also have to remove your diversity wording from your website. I know many organizations are still doing the work, but they've had to change the language around what they do. And there's a new term now, it's called diversity by stealth. So, it's very sad. And I think this is obviously going to be leaving managers feeling increasingly uncertain about how to support underrepresented talent or what they can take part in, how to manage conversations. And according to other employment lawyers, such rollbacks also heighten legal risk, which makes a lot of sense because without clear frameworks, managers may struggle to show they've taken all reasonable steps, which is in UK law, to prevent discrimination. So public sector have enhanced duties, but private sector also have to show that they've prevented discrimination if it goes to a tribunal. And actually, why wouldn't you? Because that's what you want to do. And financial news, another example from UK Financial Services, non-profit Reboot's Race to Equality report found that DEI programs are being decommissioned, and managers in these firms where the programs have been decommissioned have described growing pressure and a sense of being left without support when tackling race equality issues, which again, people are not very well equipped to deal with, especially right now when things are quite fraught. We've had the flags, we've had a lot going on, we've had horrible abuse towards people seeking safety. So this creates a big gap. So teams that maybe once benefited from structured inclusion work are now navigating very delicate environments with fewer resources and much more risk. And I think the word risk is very important here. So I hope you're enjoying the content of the podcast and want to keep up to date. If you are, then why not join my newsletter? When you join my mailing list, you'll receive my white paper on inclusive language and mental health. And that link is bit.ly/ILMHCK. Okay, so I've given you an outline. It doesn't feel great. Are things being slashed? Are they not? I think it depends on the organization, the sector, the leadership. There's a lot going on. And I wish I could tell you more, but I don't have the luxury of working with every single organization in the UK. But what I can say is, okay, so what can we do to shift this? What can be done? And I think also before I launch into the tips is to recognize that This is quite painful for many of us. We feel it, as I mentioned, on a very visceral level. It can feel incredibly degrading. It can feel like we are being propelled back into the 1970s, even for those of us who weren't alive then. So the first thing I want to say is to recognize that and to sit with the sadness sometimes we have to, and then think about what can we do. And maybe it's not for us to do, but also what our colleagues can do to help us in this situation, anyone who identifies as being part of an underrepresented or marginalized group. So the first thing I would say is build the case in the language of your organization. So language that your organization hears and understands. I think that most of these cuts are happening because leaders see it as done, board, bolt on. So we've done that, 2020, we did loads on race. Gosh, we're 5 years on and we're still talking about this. I'm really bored of it. I've got the, if it's a private company, I've got the board on my back, BOARD. And I'm really bored of this, BORED, and I just need to get on with the financials. Or a bolt on. Well, yeah, that's nice to have when things are going well. Things aren't going well right now. So can we shift the language? So I don't think this is necessarily ideal. I don't think it's necessarily where it should be coming from. But I think given where we are in the world right now, it could be a way forward. So risk management framework. So can it be incorporated into a risk management framework, especially around reputational risk? We can make people feel a little bit scared in a diplomatic way because no one wants the press knocking on their door if there's a high profile tribunal case. But also just risk management in terms of cost, resource. That if there's an internal hearing, that takes a lot of resource, all sorts of risks. We can link it to psychological frameworks, psychological safety frameworks, and health and safety frameworks as well. So there's a lot there. I think also linking it to talent retention strategy, and that has a cost implication. So that's helpful. And responding to current events rhetoric and keeping staff safe. We can link that to risk. If we don't do this, staff aren't safe. There's a physical health and safety risk here. If we're not supporting staff in terms of they don't feel safe to be out of their house because there are lots of flags on their streets. And then if there's a risk of them coming into work and then they can't work for a period of time, not that I think that should be the main driver, but often that's what's heard. We need to keep them safe because actually we can't afford a very costly recruitment process here. So that could be an example. Of course, there is data. Most organizations have data, but more and more, I do think that people have to feel things. They have to feel things that click with them. And it's very easy to ignore data that doesn't connect or move us to action in some way. And I think this is why, a lot of people are saying, the rhetoric about asylum seekers, immigration, talked about this on previous podcast episodes. You've got to show them facts, but I don't think facts work for many people because they genuinely feel that other people are taking what should rightfully be theirs. So how do we cause, and I don't know the answer to this, but for me, it's about, I could sit down with someone and show them all the facts in the world. They're not going to go away with their hearts and minds changed. What makes people feel is human connection. So, that's difficult to do in a workplace meeting often, but if there's some ways we can do that, I think that has far more impact. Okay, the second thing is to focus on high impact activities. So prioritizing potentially lower cost, high impact activities. So what could these be? Recruitment processes, non-biased. Again, it could be training. It could be watching videos that are available online. I do think you have to be a bit careful. So these need to be checked by learning and development teams to make sure they meet certain standards. Another very cost effective thing is to put positive action strapline on adverts. That doesn't cost anything and it can have high impact. Staff network groups, reinvigorate them, although I think budgets are essential to support staff network groups, but they don't have to be huge. Using staff feedback, go through old feedback. Whatever you've got, I think it's really useful to understand where to start, have things shifted. If you've got a catalogue of 5 years or even sort of 10 years, that's every other year. I think that's really, really useful to identify any areas that don't feel fair or safe. But also you've got to ensure that the burden of providing this feedback, if it's forms, that's different. It's usually anonymized or a spreadsheet. If it's qualitative and it's conversations, that feedback is shared and not solely put onto underrepresented groups. But there's a wealth of knowledge, and I think often we do these staff surveys, we do these checks, and then forget about them. I think when things are there's cash is sparse, shall we say, those resources are there, so use them. The third thing is upskill managers with practical tools. So as I mentioned, managers can really struggle, especially when DEI budgets shrink. Looking at short targeted resources, inclusive meeting checklists, for example, and check out episode 109, which is 8 ways to create culturally inclusive meetings. That's a really good thing to do, and it doesn't cost. So again, it links to high impact, low cost activities, creating culturally inclusive meetings. Conflict resolution guides, pronoun and language tips, decision-making frameworks, looking at bias. There is a lot of very good information out there. I would say that it probably needs to be a joint project with your learning and development and HR teams to ensure that it meets your guidelines for your organization. We can all go and search things. That doesn't mean it's always high quality, but there does need to be that professional check through. Also training in peer coaching, and this doesn't have to be costly, among managers so that they have a chance to discuss challenges without judgment. And I think peer coaching and mentoring is so powerful. The fourth thing is mobilizing internal advocates and senior sponsors. I do think that this area of work survives when people with influence keep shouting, and they shout loudly and they have the space to do that. I don't mean actually shouting. I mean talking about it consistently and constantly in all the spaces they are present in. And of course, if they're people with influence, they're likely to have space in all the key places, and also to be listened to. So depending on your role, can you identify one senior ally willing to publicly support what you're doing, inclusion, a specific aspect of it? I think we used to at Imperial College have executive sponsors for particular areas of work, and that worked very well. Is that something you can do? Bring them evidence, stories. We talked about that human connection is so important, and staff feedback that they can use in their papers, in their talks, in any work that they're doing. And I would also say ask them to champion a specific action. So if you have any inclusion KPIs, key performance indicators, if you have equality objectives and there's one objective that you think is just not getting done, I would absolutely say to let them lead on that in those spaces that you may or may not have access to. The fifth thing is keeping the conversation alive, which can be easy to do when there's a news story every week. But what aspects of the conversation do we want to keep alive? Because the problem is silence creates the impression that the topic no longer matters. And we can do this by having check-ins at team meetings, including giving people space to talk about how they're feeling, maybe connecting to their cultural identity if they want to, maybe a book or a film or a song that they're enjoying at the moment, a link to what's going on. They're ways of, we don't have to make it heavy. And we also don't have to create spaces where people are forced to feel vulnerable. But if you have a really good team culture and you want to talk about, okay, what aspects of your identity are really important to you, each week or each month, someone's going to present about themselves. That works really well with some teams. You will know what's best for you. But it might be more around what are you listening to? How's it resonating with you? Podcast, song, whatever it is. And keep celebrating those cultural moments without tokenism. And on my mind at the moment, and I had a great conversation with a friend last night about it, was superficial Diwali parties. So I think this year, gosh, I've seen so many beautiful photos of people celebrating Diwali in lots of high profile spaces, particularly in London. And there was a great post, and I wish I could remember who it was by. It was on Instagram. And she said, really profound things, which is, isn't it great? So many of us as South Asians never thought we'd see glamorous, beautiful South Asian people around the world celebrating Diwali. But wait a second. What's actually happening is that we're seeing a kind of glamorous Christmas party effect being superimposed onto Diwali parties. And if you think about the cultural and spiritual significance of Diwali, that's not really what it's about. So absolutely, we can organizations can, and I'm just thinking about Diwali because it was very recent, be celebrated. And, Christmas, absolutely. But how is it done in a way that acknowledges all cultures? Because, of course, Christians are global, they're around the world, and Christmas is celebrated differently in different parts of the world. So that's a way, I think, of bringing things together. As an example, but there are lots of cultural moments. I'm just giving that as an example because, of course, we've had Diwali and Christmas is coming up. But also using storytelling to surface lived experiences in ways that build empathy and momentum. As I always say, not forcing people to tell their stories, creating a space where people might come forward. And very much on my mind today is because I went to see the play last night, is a play about Jayaben Desai, the striker in Asari. You might know her as one of the first Grunwick strikers. And it was yeah, and for some reason I thought I got Grunwick and Gate Gourmet mixed up in my head, but Grunwick was the photo company that had mistreated many, many workers, majority of whom were from South Asian backgrounds. And interestingly, George Ward, one of the founders of Grunwick, was Anglo-Indian. So he had some South Asian heritage himself and treated these women and men appallingly, and her fight and how she did it. And also how I would definitely say the certain trades unions definitely let her down. So she didn't win the strike in the end, even though the Scarman inquiry said that that the workers should be allowed to unionize and to be reinstated. And that didn't happen. George Ward ignored all of that. And I just sat there thinking, wow, history really repeats itself. And my friend and I were talking about, what's happening at Amazon. So all these stories and how they repeat themselves. So that's the other thing. I think that if people don't want to tell their story, which is understandable, there is lots of social history we can look at to say history is repeating ourselves. What do we want to do as an organization differently? And I think that awareness is very important because these stories get forgotten, but there is a lot of information online about that particular story. So that was an example. And my final point is around thinking broadly. So as I said, one area of equality is often focused on, and I talk about in episode 238, shaking up your women's network, because that's an example that I often use, that equality equals senior women in an organization who have had access to resources all their life and they're from particular backgrounds and they're allowed to have the women's network, but outsourced workers are never invited to that. Or people who are considered more junior, single mothers, disabled women, that's not really spoken about. So have a listen to that for if you want more information on that. Organizations love to focus on one thing a year, but when we improve one area of the workplace, it does have positive ripple effects. And for me, universal design is the example of this. So universal design is the practice of creating products, environments, and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. It aims to be inclusive by considering a wide range of human abilities, ages, sizes, and focuses on accessibility, usability, and flexibility for everyone from the outset. So this is this idea of for everyone. It did come from a disability perspective, which is great, but it can apply to everything. So if you want to know more about universal design, do check out episode 119, Universal Design and Why It's So Important. But when I say think broadly, I think it's the approach of removing barriers where we can. So if we think about the women's networks, why are we creating barriers for women who are in more junior roles, who can't take time off from their work? We can't really afford to do this because it's not in the spirit of equity. So I think this approach is a hugely helpful one, and it can enable staff managers and leaders to see things from different perspectives. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone's really solved it. I think we're really on a wave, but it is very important to acknowledge there's a lot of unhelpful rhetoric about budgets, money, and DEI. Budgets are being slashed, and there's tumultuous times. I think one of the key things is to think broadly, to encompass this idea of removal of barriers. And things that may seem small can have a big impact. At worst, maintain good practice. At best, shift things in the right direction. So creating an environment that is using the principles of universal design, using the budgets that you have, is not only beneficial for individual employees, but also boosts morale, engagement, and retention across an organization. If you're looking to foster a well-being culture and would like guidance on creating strategies tailored to your team's needs, then we're here to support you. Please do reach out to me about training, consultancy, and coaching services designed to build a healthy, resilient workplace. You can get in touch with me at Layla, Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. I really hope you've enjoyed today's show and shows over the last 6 years. And if you have, leave me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. You can also leave me an anonymous or with your name voice note on SpeakPipe, and that link is bit.ly/SPKPZMP. And don't forget my TEDx talk about the connection between culture, race, and mental health at work. And it's just 12 minutes long, something you can watch in your break. And that link is bit.ly/TEDxWolves, WOLVESLO. And if you like it, please do comment, share, forward it to people. And don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn and Facebook. And the resources for today's show: Startup Magazine, Electronic Specifier, the Farah news article, and episodes 238, Shake Up Your Women's Network, episode 119, Universal Design, it's why it's so important, and episode number 109, Inclusive Meetings. So I really would love to hear from you, your thoughts, and please do join me in December where we'll be talking more about mental health and inclusion. Until then, bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.